The night the Vance name was buried, it was buried in red wine. Vivienne Vance had spent 3 months preparing for the winter gala at the Vanguard Plaza. She had commissioned the gown herself. It was heavy white silk tailored with microscopic precision, featuring pearl buttons running from the base of her spine to the nape of her neck. Each pearl had been sewn by hand. She had arranged the floral centerpieces, approved the 6-course menu, and confirmed the guest list twice over. 150 names. The elite of New York old money families, powerful investors, and the finest, coldest, most watchful eyes in the city all gathered under a single sprawling crystal chandelier. She had done everything right. For 4 years of marriage, she had always done everything right. Carter Vance stood at the head of the long banquet table. In his right hand, he held a heavy crystal decanter filled with vintage Bordeaux. On his face, he wore a smile that Vivienne had never seen before. It was not the polite, polished smile he wore in boardrooms. It was not the tired, distracted smile he gave her across their massive dining table on evenings when neither of them had anything left to say. This was something else entirely. This was the dark, unhurried smile of a man who had been waiting a very long time to do something terrible. Vivienne noticed the shift in his eyes exactly 2 seconds before she understood what it meant. A sudden tightening in her chest warned her the way the air changes just before lightning strikes. Carter's arm swung. He did not aim for her face. He was not that precise, or perhaps he simply did not care enough to be. The heavy crystal decanter shattered violently against the marble edge of the banquet table. The sound cracked through the ballroom like a gunshot. The contents, a full pour of deep blood-red wine, swept across the space between them and splashed violently across Vivienne's white silk gown in a devastating wave. The entire room gasped as one. Vivienne stood perfectly still. Her sharp heels dug into the marble floor. Her hands rested numbly at her sides. She looked down. The dark red liquid was spreading rapidly from her hip to her hem, soaking into the pristine white silk like something organic and terrible blooming against her skin. The coldness of the wine seeped through the fabric, chilling her stomach, but she could not force her body to move. Carter set the jagged, broken neck of the decanter down on the table with a small, deliberate click. "I have an announcement," he said. His voice carried effortlessly. The string quartet in the corner had stopped playing the very second the glass shattered, so Carter's words reached every gilded corner of the massive ballroom without any resistance. 150 guests turned their heads toward the front of the room. Crystal champagne flutes were lowered. Conversations died instantly in the throats of the city's most powerful people. Vivienne did not move. She stood inside her ruined gown, her fingers trembling slightly, her wet eyelashes blinking back the blinding light of the chandelier. She kept her chin perfectly level because in that agonizing moment, her posture was the only thing left in the world that she could control. Carter looked at her. He stared at her stained dress for a long moment, his expression entirely devoid of warmth. Then he looked away, turning his gaze to the crowd as though the sight of his wife was simply no longer interesting. "I am seeking an immediate divorce," he announced, the words echoing off the high painted ceiling. "From this woman, tonight, before all of you as witnesses." The silence that followed was not the comfortable, polite silence of a crowd waiting for a speech. It was the suffocating, heavy silence of 150 people holding their breath at the exact same time. Carter continued. His tone was conversational, almost bored, as though he were reading from a quarterly financial report rather than dismantling a marriage in front of high society. "Vivienne has failed," he said coldly. 4 years. 4 years of marriage, endless medical consultations, and not a single heir. Not one. I have been patient. I have been more than patient. I have given her every advantage, every luxury, every conceivable opportunity to fulfill her role, and she has produced absolutely nothing. He paused, letting the humiliation settle over her shoulders like a lead weight. "What use," he asked the room, "is a wife who cannot perform the single most basic duty required of her?" Vivienne heard a woman somewhere in the crowd behind her draw a sharp, theatrical breath. The floor seemed to tilt slightly under Vivienne's sharp heels. Her throat tightened so fiercely she felt she might choke on the air. She felt the heavy stares of the crowd peeling away her dignity layer by layer. Then the heavy mahogany doors at the back of the ballroom opened. They opened slowly, and the woman who walked through them did not rush. She did not need to. Harper Reed moved through the grand entrance of the Vanguard Plaza with the deliberate glowing ease of someone who had rehearsed this exact moment in her head 1,000 times. She wore gold. It was a deep, warm, liquid gold silk that caught the light of every candle and crystal in the room. And her condition was completely unmistakable. 7 months, perhaps more. Her hand rested gently on the swelling curve of her stomach. Vivienne's breath stopped entirely. Her fingernails bit so hard into her own palms that the skin nearly broke. She recognized the golden dress before she fully registered Harper's face. She had been with Harper when she chose that exact fabric 6 weeks ago. They had stood together in an exclusive boutique on Fifth Avenue, Vivienne, running her fingers along the bolt of silk, while Harper smiled and said it was for a special family celebration. A family celebration. Harper walked down the center aisle of the stunned crowd. She stopped right beside Carter. Without hesitation, Carter placed his hand at the small of Harper's back with the easy, intimate familiarity of a man who had done it 1,000 times before in the dark. "This," Carter said, his voice ringing with triumph, "is the mother of my heir." The room did not gasp this time. The room just watched. There is a very particular piercing cruelty in a crowd that has decided to observe a tragedy rather than intervene. Vivienne felt the full, crushing weight of it pressing down on her spine from every direction. 150 pairs of eyes. Some were horrified. Some were fascinated. Some, and this was the part that would carve itself into Vivienne's memory forever, were already calculating the social fallout, already composing the version of the gossip they would spread over breakfast tomorrow. Her best friend, her husband, her ruin. Vivienne's legs gave way. She did not consciously decide to fall. Her body simply made the decision without consulting her mind. Her nervous system collapsed under the sheer, suffocating weight of the betrayal. One moment she was standing tall, her chin raised in defiance. The next, the polished marble floor was rushing up to meet her. The dark, jagged stain of red wine on her white silk gown was the very last thing she saw clearly before the chandelier light blurred into a blinding haze, and the whispers of the room morphed into a single, shapeless roar. She hit the floor. The cold marble sent a shockwave through her bones, but she could not find the strength to push herself up. She lay there, a ruined woman in a ruined dress, while the people she had fed and entertained stared down at her in absolute silence. She did not feel herself hit the floor. She did not feel the bruising impact on her knees or the scrape of her palms against the unyielding stone. What she felt with agonizing clarity was the cold. The chill of the marble seeped immediately through the thin, wet silk of her ruined gown, freezing the blood in her veins. Vivienne lay there, her vision swimming in the harsh, glaring light of the crystal chandelier above. The air in the Vanguard Plaza ballroom had gone entirely still, thick with the smell of spilled vintage, Bordeaux acidic, heavy, and metallic like the scent of an open wound. She could hear her own breath, shallow and ragged, echoing in the suffocating silence of the room. She waited. For 4 years she had been a devoted wife, a gracious host, a loyal friend. She had poured her entire existence into building Carter's status. Surely out of the 150 people she had personally invited, someone would step forward. A hand to help her up. A voice to break the cruel, voyeuristic quiet. She saw the tips of Harper's golden heels in her peripheral vision. She saw Carter's polished black Oxfords. Neither of them moved. No one in the crowd moved. They simply watched her drown in her own humiliation. Then the temperature in the room dropped. It was not a draft from an open door. It was a visceral, atmospheric shift, a sudden drop in pressure that made the hairs on the back of Vivienne's neck stand up. The heavy, suffocating cruelty of the crowd was suddenly pierced by a new sound. Footsteps. They were unhurried, perfectly measured, and completely devoid of hesitation. The rhythmic click of hard leather against marble cut through the dead silence of the ballroom like a blade. Vivienne forced her eyes open, blinking past the wetness clinging to her lashes. The crowd was parting. They were not just stepping aside, they were recoiling, flattening themselves against the gilded walls and banquet tables as if an apex predator had just strolled into their cage. A shadow fell over her, blocking out the blinding glare of the chandelier. Julian Kensington, the Duke of Arrington, was not a man the New York elite described warmly. They described him accurately. He was a billionaire who operated in the shadows of global finance, a British aristocrat who owned half the skyline but had attended perhaps 3 social events in the last decade. He was 38 years old, tall, dark-haired, with a jawline cut from something entirely unforgiving and eyes the precise freezing blue of deep water in midwinter. He did not mingle. He did not smile for cameras. He existed in a stratosphere of wealth and influence so high that the people in this ballroom, even Carter Vance, were microscopic to him. He was dressed as always flawlessly and entirely in black, a bespoke wool suit that swallowed the light around it with no decorations, no ostentatious watch, just the devastating stillness of a man who possessed absolute control. Julian stopped right beside where Vivienne lay trembling in the wine-stained silk. He did not look at Carter. He did not look at Harper. He did not acknowledge the 150 terrified guests holding their breath. He looked only at Vivienne. He knelt. He did not care about the spilled wine on the marble floor. He did not care about the scandal. He slid one strong, incredibly steady hand beneath her shoulders and the other beneath the back of her knees. The physical shock of his touch jolted Vivienne out of her paralysis. What she felt was warmth, not the suffocating heat of the room, but the solid, anchoring heat of a man who had decided she was not going to stay on the ground a second longer. Before she could even process the movement, he stood lifting her into his arms effortlessly, pulling her ruined, wine-soaked dress against his pristine black suit. The scent of cold night air and faint cedar wrapped around her, drowning out the acidic smell of the Bordeaux. For the first time that night, Vivienne took a full breath. "Put her down." Carter's voice cracked like a whip across the room. It was sharp, hot, and entirely defensive. He had orchestrated this night to establish his dominance, to discard his wife like garbage, and parade his new prize. Julian Kensington's interference was tearing his script to shreds. Julian turned his head. He moved just enough to look at Carter the way a man looks at an insect that has somehow wandered onto his desk. He categorized him, evaluated his worth, and dismissed him all in the span of a single second. "You are holding my wife," Carter demanded, taking one aggressive step forward. His face flushed a dark, angry red, desperate to reclaim the narrative in front of his investors and peers. Julian did not raise his voice. He did not need to. His tone was perfectly level, yet it carried a lethal, icy weight that hit the far walls of the massive ballroom. "Your words," Julian said quietly, "made her status very clear to everyone present. I suggest you choose one position and remain in it." Carter opened his mouth, his jaw working as he searched for a retort, but the sheer crushing gravity of Julian's presence choked the words back down his throat. Harper took a nervous half-step backward, her hand dropping from her golden stomach. Julian was already turning away, but before he took his first step toward the exit, he paused, shifting his icy gaze back to Carter. He spoke 4 words. "Get away from her." The command did not echo. It simply sank into the bones of every person standing in the Vanguard Plaza. The threat was not physical. It was absolute existential annihilation packed into a single breath. Carter froze, the blood draining from his face. Julian began to walk. He carried Vivienne through the center of the grand ballroom, and the sea of guests split wide open for him without a single word being spoken. The string musicians pressed themselves into the wallpaper. The waitstaff shrank behind the service doors. Old money matriarchs and ruthless hedge fund managers stared at the floor, refusing to meet Julian's eyes. Nobody spoke, nobody reached out, nobody breathed. They simply watched the untouchable Duke of Arrington carry a ruined, discarded woman out of the ballroom as though she were the only thing of value in the entire building. Vivienne rested her head against the solid wall of his chest, closing her eyes as the heavy mahogany doors finally swung shut behind them, sealing the silence of the room. The biting chill of the New York winter hit Vivienne the moment Julian carried her through the sliding glass doors of the Vanguard Plaza. The cold was shocking, a sharp slap of reality after the suffocating perfumed heat of the ballroom. Her breath plumed in the freezing air. Julian did not break his stride. A matte black Rolls-Royce Phantom sat idling at the curb. There were no flashing lights yet, just the quiet, lethal efficiency of a billionaire's extraction. The driver, a man built like a vault door, opened the rear door without a single word. Julian stopped. He did not toss her inside. He lowered her to her feet with agonizing care, keeping one gloved hand firmly wrapped around her elbow until he was certain her legs would hold her weight. Vivienne stood on the frozen pavement. She looked at the open door of the car. Then, slowly, she turned her head to look back at the grand entrance of the plaza. Warm golden light spilled out onto the concrete stairs. Faintly through the heavy glass, she could hear the string quartet starting up again, a desperate, hollow attempt to patch over the scandal. She thought about walking back in. She thought about what returning would cost her the sneers, the pity, the devastating sight of Carter's hand resting on Harper's pregnant stomach. She turned away from the light and slid into the dark, leather-scented interior of the Phantom. Julian followed. The heavy door clicked shut instantly, severing the noise of the city. The car pulled away smoothly, merging into the endless stream of Manhattan traffic. Vivienne sat perfectly rigid. Her hands were folded tightly in her lap. The dark red wine had begun to dry on her dress, turning the heavy white silk stiff and cold against her thighs. She stared out the tinted window at the blurred neon lights of the city, watching the life she had known for 4 years accelerate away from her. She did not cry. She had the distinct impression that if she allowed a single tear to fall, she would fracture into a million irreparable pieces right there on the leather upholstery. She could not afford that. Not tonight. Not in front of this man. Julian sat beside her. He did not offer empty platitudes. He did not ask if she was all right. He simply existed in his corner of the spacious cabin, a monolith of black wool and silent authority. For 20 minutes, the only sound was the low hum of the massive engine. "Where are you taking me?" Vivienne finally asked. Her voice was brittle, scraped hollow by the adrenaline slowly leaving her system. "Kensington Estate," Julian said quietly. "It is an hour north in the Hudson Valley." Vivienne turned her head slowly from the window. "I did not agree to that." "No," Julian replied, his profile illuminated briefly by a passing street lamp. "You did not." Silence settled again, thick but not hostile. "My husband humiliated me in front of 150 of the most powerful people in New York." Vivienne said the words tasting like ash in her mouth. "By tomorrow morning, it will be on page 6. My face will be everywhere." "You do not have a husband," Julian corrected smoothly. "You have an impending legal battle, a frozen bank account by midnight, and a media circus outside your townhouse. Kensington Estate has none of those things." Vivienne looked at him. In the dim light of the cabin, his eyes were striking sharp, calculating, yet completely devoid of the predatory gleam she was so used to seeing in Carter's corporate circles. "Why?" She asked the word, slipping out before she could stop it. Julian looked out his window at the dark silhouettes of the trees beginning to replace the city skyline. He was quiet for a long time. "Because," he said softly, "no one else in that room was going to." Vivienne turned back to her window. Her own reflection looked back at her from the glass, pale, wine-stained, her carefully pinned hair beginning to unravel. She looked like a woman who had been standing on the tracks when the train came through. She thought about Harper. She thought about the gold silk dress chosen with Vivienne's own hands wrapping around a child that Carter had sworn he wanted with her. 4 years of temperature charts, clinical appointments, silent tears in empty bathrooms, and he had simply bought a new vessel. The Phantom glided off the highway and onto a private, winding road bordered by ancient, snow-dusted pines. The isolation was immediate and profound. Finally, massive wrought iron gates parted silently, revealing the imposing stone facade of Kensington Estate. It was massive Gothic and almost entirely dark against the winter sky. "It looks very cold," Vivienne noted, her voice flat. "I do not keep unnecessary fires," Julian said. "Is that a financial philosophy or a personal preference?" Something shifted in his jaw. Not quite a smile, but the faint, ghostly outline of one. Both. The staff at Kensington Estate had not been warned of a guest. That much was obvious from the way the head housekeeper, an austere woman named Mrs. Sterling, appeared at the grand entrance. She held a tablet, her posture rigid, her eyes masking a dozen urgent questions she was too professional to voice. Julian walked past her without slowing his stride. "Prepare the East Wing guest suite. Draw a hot bath immediately." Mrs. Sterling looked at Vivienne. She took in the ruined, blood-red stained silk, the shaking hands, the absolute devastation in the young woman's eyes. Then she looked at the Duke's retreating back. "Right away, sir." The East Wing suite was cavernous. It smelled faintly of cedar and expensive linen. When the maids had finished filling the clawfoot tub and quietly shut the heavy oak door behind them, leaving her completely alone, Vivienne finally stopped holding her breath. The room was utterly silent save for the crackle of the freshly lit fire in the marble hearth. Vivienne stood in the center of the Persian rug. She reached around to the nape of her neck. With trembling fingers, she unfastened the first hand-sewn pearl button, then the next. The ruined white silk slipped from her shoulders and pooled around her ankles on the floor like a discarded skin. She stepped out of it. She did not look at it again. She walked toward the steaming water, the cold of the night still clinging to her bare skin, and closed her eyes. The Vance name was dead. The woman they broke was gone. Monday arrived in Manhattan like a blade. The sky was the color of poured concrete, and the air smelled of exhaust and ruthless ambition. Julian Kensington stepped onto the top floor of Kensington Global at precisely 8 in the morning. He bypassed the panoramic views of the skyline and walked straight into his private boardroom. Waiting for him was Elias Thorne, his senior wealth manager, a man whose quiet keystrokes had orchestrated the downfall of entire sovereign economies. "Carter Vance," Julian said quietly, taking his seat at the head of the long obsidian table. Elias opened a thick leather dossier without needing to be prompted. "He holds 9 outstanding credit lines across 4 separate institutions, sir. 3 of those institutions are shadow subsidiaries of the Kensington Trust. Vance is heavily leveraged. He used his marriage to the Croft family name to secure lower interest rates, but his actual liquidity is incredibly fragile. He is funding his current lifestyle, including the recent purchase of a massive Park Avenue triplex for his new paramour entirely on debt." Julian did not look at the file. He looked out the window at the city he practically owned. "Call them in." Elias paused, his silver pen hovering over the documents. "All of them, Mr. Kensington," simultaneously. "Every single cent," Julian replied. His tone was as flat and indifferent as a judge handing down a life sentence. "Today, by noon. Furthermore, I want standard risk notifications sent to the other lending institutions indicating a sudden catastrophic change in Vance's financial profile. They will panic. They will pull their backing out of sheer self-preservation." Elias nodded slowly, understanding the sheer, terrifying brutality of the arithmetic. "This will trigger an immediate margin call. His properties will revert to the lenders within 30 days. He will be locked out of his own corporate accounts by lunchtime. That is the equation," Julian said, standing up and buttoning his suit jacket. "He took something that did not belong to him. Now we take everything that does." By 10 in the morning, the first violent tremors hit Vance Capital. Carter Vance was sitting behind his expansive mahogany desk, aggressively massaging his temples. The hangover from the weekend's victory lap was still pulsing a dull ache behind his eyes. He had successfully discarded Vivienne, publicly cemented his relationship with Harper, and positioned himself as the untouchable titan of his elite circle. He felt like a king. Then his private secure line rang. Then his CFO's line. then the emergency board channel. Within 45 minutes, the grand illusion of Carter's empire evaporated. His platinum credit accounts were frozen. The mortgage on the triplex he had just bought for Harper went into immediate default due to a buried acceleration clause his overpaid lawyers had completely overlooked. The banks were not just asking for their monthly payments, they were demanding the entire principal sums effective immediately. Carter screamed at his financial director, slamming his fists against the mahogany desk until his knuckles bruised dark purple. "Who ordered this? You don't just call in $50 million on a Monday morning without a damn warning. It's a shadow conglomerate." The CFO stammered, his face pale and slick with cold sweat. "They bought up our debt from the secondary market over the weekend. They own it all, Carter, every cent, and they want it liquidated." Before Carter could hurl his phone across the room, the office doors swung open. Harper Reed strolled in. She was wearing a designer cashmere coat, holding 3 exclusive shopping bags, her golden hair perfectly blown out. She looked like a woman who had just won the lottery, completely oblivious to the smoke filling the room. "Carter, my cards were just declined at the jeweler." She pouted, dropping the bags on the sofa. "Tell your bank to fix the glitch." Carter looked at her. For the first time, the sight of her did not fill him with pride. It filled him with a sudden, suffocating panic. "Get out!" He snapped, his voice trembling with a rage he could not control. Harper froze, her perfectly glossed lips parting in shock. The golden facade of their perfect new life cracked instantly under the weight of the missing money. Miles away in the quiet absolute sanctuary of the Kensington estate, Vivienne sat in the glass-walled conservatory. She wore a simple, oversized black cashmere sweater, a stark and comforting contrast to the tight, ruined white silk she had shed 2 nights ago. She held a porcelain cup of Earl Grey tea in both hands, letting the heat seep into her numb palms. She was watching the winter frost melt off the massive glass panes. She was not crying anymore. The shock was beginning to recede, leaving behind a cold, frightening, and absolute clarity. Julian returned to the estate just as the sun began to dip below the tree line, casting long, sharp shadows across the manicured lawns. He found her in the conservatory. He did not speak immediately. He walked over to the small marble table between them and set down a single, pristine, white envelope. "What is this?" Vivienne asked, her voice steady. "The first wave," Julian said, smoothly unbuttoning his coat and taking the armchair opposite hers. "As of 2 hours ago, Carter Vance has no access to corporate capital. His personal accounts are frozen pending a liquidity review. The triplex he purchased for Ms. Reed is currently under foreclosure proceedings." Vivienne stared at the white envelope. Her heart gave a strange, violent thud against her ribs. She thought about Carter's smug, cruel smile at the Vanguard Plaza. She thought about the wine soaking into her dress. "You did this," she whispered, looking up at him. "You bought his debt." "I had my acquisitions team working through the weekend," Julian corrected effortlessly, crossing his long legs. "It was remarkably easy. A man like your ex-husband builds his castle on sand leverage and arrogance. All it takes is one shift in the tide to drown him." Vivienne looked at the man sitting across from her, the billionaire, the untouchable Duke. "Why?" she asked again, echoing the desperate question from the phantom. Julian looked at her. His icy blue eyes softened just a microscopic fraction, revealing the terrifying, fathomless depths of his protection. "Because revenge is loud, Vivienne," he said quietly. "But absolute destruction is silent, and I prefer silence." Vivienne had been living in the silent, sprawling sanctuary of Kensington Estate for 5 days. The sheer, overwhelming size of the Gothic mansion offered her the one luxury she desperately needed: absolute, unquestioned solitude. For 4 years, she had existed under the constant, microscopic scrutiny of Carter's social circle. Now the heavy stone walls of the estate acted as a fortress, keeping the chaotic, bloodthirsty media circus of Manhattan safely locked outside. She had developed a routine of walking the endless corridors in the late mornings when the winter sunlight was pale and the estate staff were occupied elsewhere. She was slowly putting the broken pieces of herself back together, sealing the cracks with a quiet, hardening resolve. On the 5th day, she ventured into the restricted West Wing. She opened a heavy oak door that she had assumed led to an unused linen closet or a secondary library. It was neither. Vivienne stepped over the threshold and stopped, her breath catching in her throat. It was a long, narrow gallery, but it looked nothing like the curated, ostentatious art collections Carter used to buy simply to impress his investors. There were no velvet ropes, no gold plaques. The air smelled faintly of linseed oil, turpentine, and old paper. The walls were covered from floor to ceiling with unframed canvases. They were not portraits. They were landscapes, but painted with such raw, violent emotion that they felt almost entirely alive. There was a jagged black cliff face rising out of a stormy, bruised ocean. There was a dense, fog-choked Scottish valley rendered in haunting shades of gray and silver. There was a city skyline painted not from a penthouse window, but from a terrifying, dizzying angle looking down into the dark concrete canyons. Vivienne walked slowly down the center of the room. She read the paintings the way one might read a private letter written in someone else's desperate handwriting. The person who had painted these canvases was intimately familiar with isolation, with the cold, and with the crushing weight of surviving in a world that demanded ruthlessness. At the far end of the gallery, pushed against a tall frosted window, sat a small, scarred wooden drafting table. On top of it lay a heavy leather-bound journal. Vivienne hesitated. For 4 years she had been trained not to touch things that did not belong to her, but the profound silence of the room pulled her forward. She reached out her fingertips, brushing the worn leather, and gently opened the cover. It was a list written in sharp, precise, forward-slanting handwriting that she instantly recognized from the legal documents Julian had signed. There were dates, some stretching back over a decade, and beside each date was a location. The coastal cliffs of Blackwood Point, a remote lighthouse on the edge of the North Sea, a glacial lake in the Swiss Alps, a specific bridge in the Scottish Highlands with a tiny meticulous note beside it indicating the exact hour the autumn light hit the stone. Some of the entries had a single neat line drawn through them, the quiet mark of a destination reached. But the vast majority of the list remained untouched, unvisited. Vivienne traced the ink of the uncrossed words. Her heart ached with a strange, sudden intensity. She understood the billionaire titan who could crush a man's empire before lunch. But this list, this quiet, yearning catalog of lonely places, belonged to a man she had never met. It belonged to a man who was rationing his time. "I do not usually bring guests to this wing." Vivienne gasped, her hand jerking away from the journal. She spun around. Julian was standing in the doorway. He wore a dark charcoal sweater and black trousers, his silver-headed cane resting lightly against his palm. He did not look angry. He did not possess the volatile, explosive temper that Carter wielded like a weapon. Instead, his icy blue eyes swept over the room, carrying a quiet, heavy vulnerability that he usually kept buried under miles of steel. "I am so sorry," Vivienne said, quickly stepping away from the desk. "I was just walking. I didn't mean to intrude on your privacy." Julian did not move. He looked at the paintings, then down at the open leather journal, and finally at her. "Do not apologize," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble in the quiet room. He walked slowly toward her, his footsteps barely making a sound against the hardwood floor. He stopped beside the drafting table, close enough that she could feel the ambient heat radiating from him. "Did you find it interesting?" he asked quietly. Vivienne looked up at him. She dropped the polite, defensive mask she had worn for years. "I found it breathtaking," she said honestly, "and I found it incredibly sad." Julian's jaw tightened. He looked out the frosted window at the frozen grounds of the estate. "I painted them," he said, confirming what she already knew. "Some from memory, some from descriptions, some from pure imagination." "And the list?" Vivienne asked, her voice dropping to a whisper. "The list," Julian replied, his gaze distant, "is a collection of places I intended to see. Before the obligations of the Kensington Trust demanded all of my attention. Before..." He trailed off, the silence hanging heavy between them. Vivienne looked down at the first entry on the uncrossed page. "Blackwood Point," she read softly. "It is only an hour drive from here." Julian looked back at her. The winter light caught the sharp angles of his face, highlighting the exhaustion he usually hid so well. "It is. I have never been there," Vivienne said. She took a step closer to him, closing the physical distance between them for the first time since the night he carried her out of the ballroom. She looked directly into his freezing blue eyes, refusing to look away. "Take me." Julian stared at her. The untouchable Duke, the man who calculated global market crashes in his sleep, looked entirely caught off guard. He looked at the woman he had pulled from the wreckage of a shattered marriage, seeing the fierce, unyielding spark of life returning to her eyes. "Tomorrow morning," Julian said quietly, the ghost of a real smile touching the corners of his mouth. "Dress warmly, Vivienne. The wind off the water is unforgiving." The trip to Blackwood Point had changed the atmospheric pressure inside the Kensington estate. When they returned, the silence between Vivienne and Julian was no longer the cautious, measured distance of two strangers coexisting in a fortress. It had shifted into something deeper, something resonant and quietly anchored. Vivienne had stood on the edge of that freezing cliff looking down at the violent churning water and felt the last remnants of Carter Vance's psychological grip on her wash away. But it was the sound that found her first shattering the fragile peace of the estate. It was Thursday morning. The sun had not yet breached the horizon, and the massive stone manor was immersed in that specific deep structural silence that exists before the staff begins their daily routines. Vivienne had woken early, her mind sharp and restless. She pulled a heavy silk robe over her shoulders and walked barefoot down the carpeted east corridor, the faint moonlight guiding her steps. As she neared the heavy double oak doors of Julian's private study, she heard it. It was a cough. Not the shallow passing clear of a throat, but a harsh, wet, agonizing sound that tore through the quiet hallway. It was followed by a long, terrible pause, the kind of suffocating silence that comes from a person desperately trying to conceal their own physical collapse. Vivienne stopped dead in her tracks. Her hand hovered an inch from the brass doorknob. She told herself it was nothing. The biting wind from the cliffs 2 days ago, a minor winter chill. She tried to convince her racing heart that the untouchable billionaire, the man who had dismantled her ex-husband's empire with a single phone call, was invincible. Then she heard the sound again. This time it was lower, more effortful, and carrying a terrifying, rattling weight. Her conviction vanished entirely. She did not knock. She pushed the heavy oak door open. Julian was standing at the far end of the sprawling, shadowed study. His back was to her. One hand was pressed flat and hard against the edge of his massive mahogany desk, his knuckles stark white from the pressure. His broad shoulders were heaving. In his other hand, pressed tightly to his mouth, was a square of pristine white silk. He heard the click of the door latch and went completely, terrifyingly still. It was the precise arrested motion of a predator caught in a snare it had spent years avoiding. He slowly lowered his hand. He turned his head just enough for the dim pre-dawn light to catch his profile. Vivienne saw the handkerchief before he could fold it away. There was a dark, jagged stain at the dead center of the white silk. It was not the bright, careless crimson of spilled wine. It was rust-red, thick, and unmistakable, the color of something vital that had absolutely no business being outside the human body. The air in the room instantly dropped 10 degrees. The metallic scent of blood and cold ash from the dead fireplace hung between them. Neither of them spoke. Julian folded the silk handkerchief with deliberate, excruciating care, tucking it away into the breast pocket of his dark trousers. When he finally turned to face her fully, his expression was composed. It was that same careful, unreadable architecture of power she had seen in the Vanguard Plaza ballroom. But beneath it, for the very first time, there was a microscopic fracture, the faint, undeniable outline of exposure. "You should be asleep, Vivienne," he said. His voice was low, slightly raspy, but perfectly controlled. "You should have told me," she replied. The words came out much steadier than the violent drumming in her chest. A new kind of terror was blooming inside her, but it was fundamentally different from the pathetic, humiliating fear she had felt with Carter. This was a fierce, protective terror. It was the terrifying realization that the man who had saved her was quietly drowning in his own private ocean. Julian moved away from the desk. He lowered himself into the leather chair with a careful, conserved movement that Vivienne suddenly recognized for what it was. It was not the relaxed posture of a billionaire at rest. It was economic. It was the movement of a man who was rationing his physical energy the way a starving man rations his last crust of bread. "How long have you known?" Vivienne asked, stepping fully into the study. The cold floor bit into her bare feet, but she did not care. She walked directly toward him. Julian looked at her steadily. The icy blue of his eyes was banked, stripped of its usual intimidating glare. 2 years, he said quietly. Vivienne did not wait for an invitation. She sat down in the leather chair directly across from his desk. She sat with her spine completely straight, projecting a cold, elegant defiance. "The specialists. What do they say?" "They say a great number of things," Julian murmured, resting his chin on his steepled fingers. "Most of which I stopped listening to after the first 6 months. It is progressive. A degenerative scarring of the lung tissue exacerbated by a localized plane crash I survived a decade ago. Over time, it has simply worsened." Vivienne thought about the secret gallery, the dark sweeping paintings, the leather-bound journal with its meticulous, desperate list of unvisited places. She thought about the way he had looked at the crashing waves at Blackwood Point, not like a man admiring real estate, but like a man memorizing the shape of the world before he had to leave it. "The list," she said, her voice dropping to a whisper. Julian said nothing. His silence was the most devastating confirmation she could have received. Vivienne looked down at her hands resting in her lap. For 4 years, her life had been defined by a man who took everything from her. Now she was sitting across from a man who had given her everything only to realize he had been bleeding out while doing it. "Were you ever going to tell me?" she asked, looking up. Her gaze was sharp, piercing, straight through his armor. "I was waiting for the appropriate moment," Julian said. "I did not want you to stay in this house out of pity or obligation. You came here fleeing a situation where you were trapped by the expectations of a cruel man. I refuse to become another prison for you, Vivienne." The words hung in the air, heavy with a devastating kind of nobility. Vivienne stood up. She did not tremble. The woman who had collapsed in tears on the marble floor of the Vanguard Plaza was dead. In her place stood someone forged in the fires of betrayal and tempered by the freezing grace of the Duke of Arrington. She walked around the mahogany desk. She stopped right beside his chair, looking down at the ruthless billionaire who had just handed her his greatest vulnerability. "I do not do pity, Julian," Vivienne said, her voice ringing with absolute unshakable certainty. "And I am done running. You burned my past to the ground to keep me safe. I am staying right here to help you finish your list." The letter arrived on a Tuesday, delivered by a breathless private courier who was heavily intimidated by the towering iron gates of the Kensington estate. Vivienne recognized the slanted, hurried handwriting before she even broke the wax seal. She had received countless notes in that exact script over the past 4 years. Harper Reed wrote the way she lived with the superficial appearance of warmth, barely concealing the frantic, calculating efficiency of a woman who always wanted more than she had. Vivienne carried the heavy cream envelope into the conservatory, sitting by the frost-covered glass before opening it. The message was brief, desperate, and dripping with venom. It stated that Harper wished to meet. It detailed how Carter's financial empire was crumbling by the hour his assets seized his reputation in a freefall. Then came the leverage. Harper wrote that if Vivienne did not call off her billionaire attack dog. Harper was fully prepared to go to the press. She threatened to leak the details of Vivienne's living arrangements, spinning a scandalous narrative that Vivienne had been Julian Kensington's secret mistress all along, framing her as the true villain of the Vance divorce. "I hope you will be sensible," Vivienne, the letter concluded. "You have already lost. Do not make this uglier than it needs to be." Vivienne read the letter twice. She did not tremble. She did not feel the familiar suffocating panic that Harper and Carter used to instill in her. Instead, she felt a profound, chilling emptiness. She folded the letter with precise, sharp creases, slipped it into the pocket of her wool trousers, and walked down to the secure storage room in the estate's lower level. 2 days prior, Julian's private security detail had extracted the last of Vivienne's personal effects from the Vance penthouse. The items sat in neat stacked leather trunks. She had not found the strength to open them yet. Today, the strength found her. She unlocked the first trunk. Inside were closed books and a collection of exquisite, meaningless gifts Carter had bought to apologize for his absences. And resting at the very bottom was a beautifully crafted midnight blue leather vanity case. Vivienne stared at it. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. Harper had given her that case 3 years ago, just after Vivienne's second devastatingly negative pregnancy test. Harper had held her hand, wiped her tears, and presented the blue leather case filled with custom blended herbal teas and organic supplements. For your constitution, Harper had said, her voice dripping with sisterly concern. My mother used this blend. I'll make it for you myself every Thursday. And she had. Every single Thursday for 3 years, Harper had come to the penthouse, brewed the tea, and watched Vivienne drink every last drop. Vivienne dropped to her knees on the cold stone floor. She reached into the trunk and pulled the heavy blue case onto her lap. She opened the brass latch. It was mostly empty now, smelling faintly of dried lavender and old silk. But as she ran her fingers along the interior, she felt a subtle irregularity. The silk lining near the hinge was unnaturally stiff. With a sudden violent pull, Vivienne ripped the silk lining away from the leather backing. A hidden compartment tore open. Out fell a dozen small, unmarked wax paper packets and a single thumb-sized dark green glass vial, securely corked. Vivienne stopped breathing. She stared at the dark green glass rolling slowly across the stone floor. She did not touch it immediately. A cold, horrifying realization began to claw its way up her throat, so dark and monstrous that her mind instinctively tried to reject it. She did not scream. She carefully picked up the vial, wrapped it in a clean linen handkerchief, and walked straight out of the storage room. An hour later, Vivienne sat in the sterile, soundproofed clinic located in the west wing of the estate. Julian's private physician, a brilliant, austere man named Dr. Aldous, sat across from her. He had been running chemical analyses on the contents of the green vial for the past 40 minutes. The silence in the clinic was deafening. Finally, Dr. Aldous set his glasses on the steel table and looked at her. His expression was one of profound professional horror. Mrs. Vance, he began, his voice tight. Just Vivienne. She corrected her voice, perfectly dead. Vivienne, he amended softly. What I have found in this vial is a highly concentrated synthesized compound of pennyroyal black cohosh and specific heavy metal trace elements. In small isolated doses, it causes severe abdominal cramping, but administered consistently over a sustained period of years. He swallowed hard, unable to maintain eye contact with her. It acts as a potent absolute abortifacient. Furthermore, it aggressively suppresses ovulation. It is completely odorless. It would dissolve instantly in hot water or tea. Anyone consuming this on a regular basis would experience total, medically inexplicable infertility. And if a pregnancy ever did manage to take root, this compound would terminate it within weeks. Vivienne stared at the gleaming steel table. She thought about the endless, humiliating doctor's appointments Carter had dragged her to. She thought about Carter standing in the Vanguard Plaza, declaring her a failure, a useless wife who could not perform her basic duty. And then she thought about Harper. Harper sitting across from her in the sunlit penthouse, offering her a steaming cup of tea with a warm, comforting smile. Harper listening to her cry. Harper stealing her husband, moving into her home, and carrying the child that Vivienne had been chemically poisoned to prevent. It was not a biological failure. It was murder. A slow, systematic murder of her future, orchestrated by the woman she had called her best friend. Can you document this, Dr. Aldous? Vivienne asked. Her voice did not crack. It sounded like shattering ice. "Can you mathematically prove the sustained dosage required to cause the symptoms I exhibited?" "Yes," Dr. Aldous said gravely. "The medical evidence is irrefutable." "Thank you." Vivienne stood up. She picked up the dark green vial, carefully placing it inside her designer handbag. The woman who had wept on the marble floor was entirely gone. In her place was something carved from absolute zero. She did not feel sorrow. She did not feel the need to cry. She felt the terrifying electric thrill of absolute clarity. She walked out of the clinic, pulled Harper's desperate letter from her pocket, and looked at the address of the tea room where her former best friend wanted to meet. Carter Vance had taken her dignity, but Harper Reed had stolen her blood, and Vivienne was going to make sure that the price Harper paid would be exacted in front of the entire world. The L'Orangerie Tea Room on the Upper East Side was the kind of establishment where fortunes were quietly dismantled over porcelain cups and silver spoons. It was public enough to prevent raised voices, yet exclusive enough to ensure absolute privacy from the press. Vivienne arrived 20 minutes early. She requested a corner table by the floor-to-ceiling windows, affording her a perfect view of the entrance and the tactical advantage of watching her enemy arrive. She wore a tailored midnight black crepe dress that moved like liquid armor. There were no diamonds, no ostentatious displays of the Kensington wealth, just the devastating, terrifying elegance of a woman who no longer had anything to prove. She ordered a pot of Darjeeling tea. She did not pour a cup. Harper Reed arrived precisely on time. The contrast between the woman who had glided into the Vanguard Plaza in glowing gold silk and the woman walking through the tea room doors was stark. Harper was dressed impeccably in a cream cashmere coat, but the edges of her illusion were heavily fraying. The dark circles under her eyes had been plastered over with expensive concealer. Her movements, once fluid and triumphant, were now jerky, betraying the sheer panic of a woman watching her stolen billionaire lifestyle evaporate before her very eyes. Harper spotted Vivienne and walked over her chin, tilted up in a desperate, fragile approximation of superiority. She sat down opposite Vivienne, dropping her designer handbag onto an empty chair. "Vivienne," Harper said, attempting a smile that looked more like a painful grimace. "I'm glad you decided to be sensible." Vivienne did not smile. She did not blink. She merely looked at Harper with the cold scientific fascination of an entomologist studying a particularly repulsive insect pinned to a board. "You look exhausted, Harper," Vivienne noted quietly, her voice perfectly smooth and hollow. Harper's jaw tightened. "I am pregnant, Vivienne. It is physically taxing, but I suppose you wouldn't know anything about that." It was a cruel, reflexive strike, the kind of petty surgical dagger Harper had used for years disguised as sympathy. But this time, the blade simply snapped against Vivienne's armor. Vivienne's expression did not alter by a single fraction. "You mentioned in your letter that you had a narrative you wished to share with the press." "I do," Harper said, leaning forward, her voice dropping to an urgent, venomous hiss. "Carter is losing everything. His companies, the triplex, the offshore accounts. Your new billionaire attack dog is destroying him. You need to call him off, Vivienne. If you don't, I will call the Times. I will tell them you've been sleeping with Julian Kensington for years. I will tell them the divorce was your fault. I will drag your name through the mud until you are a laughingstock in this city." Harper sat back, breathing heavily, clearly waiting for the visceral reaction. She was waiting for Vivienne to flinch to panic, to fold the way she always had during their 4 years of friendship. Vivienne reached into her black leather handbag. Her movements were slow, deliberate, and completely devoid of fear. She did not produce a checkbook. She did not produce a drafted non-disclosure agreement. She withdrew the thumb-sized dark green glass vial. She placed it gently on the pristine white linen tablecloth right between them. The glass made a soft, heavy click against the wood beneath the cloth. Harper looked down at the vial. The physical reaction was instantaneous and violent. The blood drained from Harper's face so rapidly that her skin took on the color of wet ash. Her mouth fell open in a silent, jagged gasp, her eyes widening in absolute, unadulterated terror. Her hands resting on the edge of the table began to visibly shake. "I found the blue Vanity case," Vivienne said. Her voice was barely above a whisper, yet it possessed a gravitational pull that sucked the oxygen straight out of the room. "The one you so graciously helped me pack when I moved my things. I found the hidden compartment sewn into the silk lining." Harper tried to speak, but her throat just produced a pathetic, dry, clicking sound. "Pennyroyal, black cohosh, trace heavy metals." Vivienne recited smoothly, her eyes locked onto Harper's terrified face. "Odorless, tasteless, highly effective at inducing chemical infertility and early-stage termination when administered every Thursday over a period of 3 years." "Vivienne, you can't prove..." Harper stammered, her voice cracking, her perfect golden facade crumbling into dust right in the middle of the l'orangerie. "Dr. Aldous, the chief medical officer of the Kensington Trust, has fully documented the chemical breakdown." Vivienne cut in smoothly, slicing through the desperate lie. "He has mathematically correlated the sustained dosage with my exact medical records from the Vance estate. Furthermore, Julian's security team paid a visit to the holistic apothecary in Soho, where you purchase these raw ingredients. They keep very meticulous records of their highest-paying clients. They have your signature on file, Harper. Dozens of them." A waiter approached the table, carrying a silver tray with pastries. Vivienne held up one perfectly manicured hand, signaling him away without ever breaking eye contact with the trembling woman across from her. Harper's hands flew to her pregnant stomach, a gesture of pure defensive panic. Tears began to spill over her heavily concealed dark circles, leaving ugly black streaks of mascara down her pale cheeks. "Carter chose me," Harper whispered hysterically, leaning over the table, clinging to the very last delusion she possessed. "He loved me. You were in the way. You were always just a stepping stone for his image. He wanted me to be the mother of his children." Vivienne looked at the woman she had once called a sister. She felt no anger. She felt only a vast glacial superiority. "Carter Vance does not know how to love," Vivienne said, her tone dripping with quiet devastation. "He used you because you were convenient, Harper, and the moment the Kensington Trust called in his debts yesterday, he proved exactly who he is. I know he froze your credit cards. I know you are sitting here begging me to stop the bleeding because Carter is already looking for someone else to blame for his downfall." Harper let out a choked, ragged sob. She reached across the table, her trembling fingers inches from the green vial. "Please, please, Vivienne. They will put me in a federal prison. I'm pregnant. You can't do this." "I am not doing anything," Vivienne said. She picked up the dark green vial and slipped it back into her handbag. She stood up, smoothing the front of her black dress with terrifying elegance. "I have already submitted the medical reports, the apothecary receipts, and the chemical analysis to the district attorney's office. They are currently drafting the felony warrants for systematic poisoning and aggravated assault." Harper froze, her eyes blown wide in absolute horror, the reality of a cold prison cell finally eclipsing the fantasy of the Park Avenue triplex. "Enjoy your tea, Harper," Vivienne said softly, looking down at the broken, weeping woman. "I hear it is excellent for the Constitution." Vivienne turned her back and walked away. The sharp measured clicks of her heels echoed across the marble floor. She did not look back as Harper collapsed onto the table, weeping uncontrollably. She pushed open the heavy glass doors, stepping out into the freezing Manhattan air, entirely untouchable. The mahogany-paneled chamber of the Manhattan Federal Courthouse possessed the heavy, suffocating atmosphere of a crypt. Room 4B was not a standard courtroom. It was the designated arena for high-stakes corporate arbitration and severe white-collar criminal hearings, a place where the titans of New York high society came to either cement their legacies or watch them burn to ash. It smelled of lemon polish, old leather, and the distinct metallic tang of impending ruin. Vivienne sat in the front row of the gallery, her posture entirely flawless. She wore a tailored slate gray wool suit that mirrored the cold, unyielding sky outside the high arched windows. Beside her, occupying the heavy wooden chair with the quiet, terrifying stillness of a dormant volcano, was Julian Kensington. He had insisted on attending. Vivienne had insisted he sit and conserve his strength. They had reached this compromise in the quiet hours of the morning, communicating in the soft, efficient language of two people who implicitly understood each other's burdens. Julian leaned slightly against his silver-headed cane. His face was paler than usual, the shadows beneath his freezing blue eyes stark in the fluorescent lighting, but his presence was an absolute fortress. When the heavy wooden doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, he did not even blink. Carter Vance walked down the center aisle. He looked like a ghost of the man who had stood at the head of the Vanguard Plaza ballroom just weeks prior. The bespoke navy suit he wore hung loosely on his frame. His shoulders slumped under the crushing weight of astronomical debt. He took his seat at the defense table, his hands trembling slightly as he arranged a stack of useless legal documents. A moment later, Harper Reed was escorted into the room by her frantic, visibly outmatched defense attorney. She did not wear designer cashmere today. She wore a shapeless, muted dress, her golden hair tied back harshly. She looked terrified, her eyes darting wildly around the room until they landed on Vivienne. Harper quickly looked away, shrinking into her chair. The gallery behind them was packed. It was not filled with the general public. It was filled with the very people Carter had spent his entire life trying to impress: board members, venture capitalists, former friends, and the elite society matriarchs who had attended the winter gala. They had all come to watch the slaughter. The presiding judge, the Honorable Marcus Sterling, a man with 3 decades of experience and zero patience for corporate arrogance, struck his gavel. The sharp cracking sound instantly silenced the room. The proceedings were methodical, clinical, and completely devastating. First came the financial execution. The chief arbitrator read the staggering list of Carter's defaulted loans, the fraudulent leverage applications, and the immediate seizure of his assets. The Kensington Trust's legal representatives submitted the final acquisition papers. Within 15 minutes, the court legally stripped Carter Vance of his holding company, his corporate accounts, and his remaining real estate. He was ordered to vacate his properties within 48 hours. The empire he had built on Vivienne's back was wiped out with a few strokes of a pen. Carter sat frozen. He did not argue. He had nothing left to fight with. Then the atmosphere in the courtroom shifted from cold financial arithmetic to something entirely darker. The assistant district attorney stood up from the prosecution table, carrying a thick manila folder and a sealed evidence bag containing a dark green glass vial. "Your Honor," the ADA began, her voice echoing clearly off the high wooden ceiling. "We move to address the severe criminal injunctions filed against Ms. Harper Reed pertaining to sustained malicious and systematic poisoning." A collective horrified gasp rippled through the gallery of elites. Carter's head snapped up, his bloodshot eyes widening in sheer confusion. The ADA detailed the findings. She read Dr. Aldis's immaculate medical report. She listed the chemical compounds pennyroyal black cohosh heavy metals. She presented the apothecary receipts bearing Harper's signature. She explained with chilling surgical precision how Harper Reed had spent 3 years dissolving an odorless, tasteless abortifacient into Vivienne Vance's tea. The defendant deliberately induced chemical infertility, the ADA stated firmly. She orchestrated the very medical failure that led to the dissolution of the Vance marriage, positioning herself to take the victim's place. The courtroom descended into a stunned, breathless silence. Carter Vance slowly turned his head. He looked at Harper, the woman he had proudly paraded in front of 150 guests, the woman he had chosen because she could give him the air that his defective wife could not. The realization hit Carter with the physical force of a freight train. Vivienne had not failed him. She had been perfect. She had been loyal, loving, and entirely devoted. and he had humiliated her, discarded her, and destroyed his own life for the very parasite who had orchestrated the entire tragedy. Carter's face twisted into an expression of absolute soul-crushing agony. His chest heaved. He looked across the courtroom past the wooden barricade, desperately searching for Vivienne's eyes. When he found them, he saw nothing. There was no anger, no sadness, no lingering trace of the woman who had loved him. Her eyes were as cold and deep as a frozen lake. Carter's lips moved. "I'm sorry," he mouthed soundlessly, his face crumpling in profound, pathetic regret. "I didn't know. I'm so sorry." It was the apology of a broken man who had finally realized the true cost of his arrogance. It was the ultimate, devastating regret. Vivienne did not offer him a single millimeter of forgiveness. She simply broke eye contact, turning her attention back to the judge, dismissing Carter Vance from her consciousness forever. Beside her, Julian shifted slightly. He reached out his large, warm hand, covering hers, where it rested on the armrest of the wooden chair. His long fingers intertwined with hers, a quiet, immovable anchor of absolute power and protection. The judge's gavel fell one final time. Harper Reed was formally remanded into state custody, weeping hysterically, as two court officers pulled her by the arms toward the side exit. Carter Vance remained slumped at his table, a financially ruined, publicly despised hollow shell of a man staring at the floor. Vivienne stood up. She smoothed the front of her slate gray suit. She did not look back at the wreckage they had left behind. She placed her hand lightly on Julian's arm, and together the billionaire Duke and the untouchable woman he had forged from the ruins walked out of the courtroom, leaving the silence of the Vanguard Plaza completely avenged. They married in the first week of May. There were no press photographers, no sprawling banquet tables, and no crystal decanters. The ceremony took place in the private centuries-old stone chapel situated on the far western edge of the Kensington estate. The morning air was crisp smelling of damp earth and the first blooming hyacinths of the season. Vivienne did not wear white. She had shed the traditions of her past life completely. She wore a heavy sweeping gown of deep emerald silk, a color that spoke of endurance, survival, and roots refusing to die beneath the winter frost. She walked down the short stone aisle, alone, her head held high, the sound of her heels echoing softly against the ancient walls. Julian stood at the altar waiting for her. He wore a bespoke charcoal suit. He was leaning on his silver-headed cane, the physical toll of the progressing illness visible in the sharp, pale angles of his face. But as he watched Vivienne walk toward him, his freezing blue eyes were filled with an unguarded, overwhelming light. It was the look of a man who had spent his entire life building impenetrable fortresses, only to realize the only thing worth protecting was walking right toward him. The ceremony was brief. The vows were spoken quietly without theatrics binding them in the unbreakable language of two survivors. When Julian slid the ring onto her finger, a flawless vintage emerald-cut diamond that had belonged to the first Duchess of Arrington, he did not look at the priest. He looked only at Vivienne. "Always," Julian whispered, his thumb brushing over her knuckles. "Always," Vivienne echoed, her voice steady and absolute. The months that followed were not an illusion of perfection. They were beautifully, fiercely real. Vivienne officially assumed the title of the Duchess of Arrington. With Julian's health requiring him to conserve his energy, Vivienne stepped forward to manage the philanthropic and strategic arms of the colossal Kensington Trust. The financial world quickly learned that the new Duchess was not a figurehead. She was brilliant, ruthless, and entirely untouchable. She commanded boardrooms with a terrifying, elegant calm. Those who remembered the scandal of the Vanguard Plaza now bowed their heads when she entered a room. Carter Vance had become a forgotten ghost, a cautionary tale whispered in the dark corners of Wall Street, currently working off his catastrophic debts in a windowless cubicle of a third-tier logistics firm. Harper Reed was serving a multi-year sentence in a federal facility. Her beauty faded, her golden illusions shattered against the concrete reality of a prison cell. But Vivienne's true victory did not happen in the boardrooms or the courts. It happened quietly across the globe. Throughout the summer and early autumn, they traveled. They took the private jet to the glacial lakes of the Swiss Alps. They stood on the stone bridge in the Scottish Highlands at the exact hour the autumn light hit the water, just as the meticulous note in Julian's journal had described. Vivienne stood beside her husband, feeling the cold wind whip through her hair, watching Julian cross the final lines off his list. He was tired, his breathing often labored, but he was undeniably completely at peace. Then winter returned to New York. It was a Tuesday in December. The estate grounds were buried under a thick, pristine blanket of white snow. Vivienne sat in the medical wing of the estate, her hands resting in her lap. Dr. Aldous stood across from her, holding a set of lab results. The austere physician, a man who had seen decades of medical tragedies, had tears standing in his eyes. Over the past 10 months, under Dr. Aldous's rigorous care, Vivienne's system had slowly, painstakingly flushed out the heavy metals and toxins Harper had fed her. Her body had healed. Duchess, Dr. Aldous said, his voice trembling slightly. The tests are conclusive. It is a mathematical certainty. Vivienne closed her eyes. A single hot tear broke free and tracked down her cheek. It was not a tear of sorrow, but a profound, shattering release. She found Julian in the conservatory. He was resting in the armchair, wrapped in a dark cashmere blanket, watching the snow fall against the glass panes. The afternoon light cast long, quiet shadows across the marble floor. Vivienne walked over to him. She did not sit in the opposite chair. She knelt on the floor beside him, taking both of his large, cold hands in hers. Julian looked down at her, his brow furrowing slightly in concern. "Vivienne, what is it?" She pressed his hands against her stomach. Her eyes were bright, fierce, and overflowing with the miracle they had been told was entirely impossible. "We need to add a new name to the Kensington Trust." Vivienne whispered, her voice breaking with pure, unfiltered joy. "We are having a child." Julian went completely still. The billionaire Duke, the cold tactician who could calculate global markets in his sleep, lost all of his armor. His breath hitched. He stared at her, then down at her stomach and back up to her face. Slowly he slid from the armchair down to the floor, kneeling right there on the marble beside her. He wrapped his arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her as though she were the very center of the universe. The heir to the Kensington Empire, a boy named Leo Alexander Kensington, was born the following autumn. He was born in the massive master suite of the estate, surrounded by the best medical team money could buy, but most importantly, surrounded by love. When Julian held his son for the first time, his hands shook. He looked at the tiny sleeping face, and then he looked up at Vivienne. His physical strength was fading, but his legacy was secure. He had found his ultimate destination. Years later, Vivienne would stand by the massive windows of the East Wing, watching her son run across the manicured lawns. She wore black crepe and a diamond necklace that caught the light of the chandelier. She was the Dowager Duchess, the absolute ruler of the Kensington Empire. She had been laughed at. She had been cast out. She had been left on a marble floor in a ruined dress. But she had not broken. She had returned colder, sharper, and infinitely stronger. She had taken the shattered pieces of her life and built an untouchable throne. And as the winter wind howled against the glass of the estate, Vivienne Kensington smiled. The woman they replaced was the only real queen who had ever walked into the room. At which moment in this story do you think changed her the most? Do you believe more in the power of emotional justice or the grace of forgiveness? And in your opinion, when the damage is already done, is a too late apology ever really enough? If this story of absolute survival, cold revenge, and untouchable power resonated with you, hit that subscribe button right now. Leave a comment below with your thoughts, like this video, and share it with someone who needs a reminder that the strongest queens are forged in the coldest fires. Welcome to the family. We are just getting started.